And in front of the camera right now is DiFranco. And Ani, what do you think the future of feminism is?
Wow, it's a big question. I don't know. Well, I guess first of all, I guess I would say that I hesitate to even be, a spokesperson for the future of feminism, because I hope that one of the aspects of its future is diversification. And, there are sort of, I think that, or I hope that in, people of my generation, feminism is more of a presupposition in our lives. Like we just are feminists, like young women, it's sort of an assumption now, where I think that, I don't know, back in ye olde days, it was a little more of a sort of a taboo, obscure kind of, political organization that had one room and 4 pencils. And now I think it's kind of more of an assumption among young women in our country. We have all these role models, and I come from the world of rock and roll, so there are all these role models of strong women out there making music and doing all sorts of things. So I think it's much more kind of culturally acceptable, in youth culture. But I'm hoping that will, at least lead, say, first off, to the embracing of the word feminism. I think we haven't quite gotten there yet. I think it's still a bit of a dirty word, even though I think most young women now are operating under, principles of feminism. I think that, there's, self-determination is kind of an assumption now among youth culture. I think that still that a whole lot of us are afraid to use the word, which is sort of strange to me. Like in the world of rock and roll. For instance, there are all these women out there stomping around, playing their music, singing about their lives, and avoiding the term feminist, to describe themselves. Because I think it's, there's still all that connotation of, if you're a feminist, you're ugly and you're humorless, and, no boy is gonna date you, or whatever the priority is there. So, I'm hoping that the word feminist will become more, embraced in the future, because I think my idea of feminism personally is a very inclusive, very open one. I think that anybody who believes in women's right of self-determination is a feminist. So basically, if you're not an utter sexist or a complete misogynist, you're a feminist. I would hope that more young women and men and, dogs and cats are going to use that term to describe themselves. And I think the more it sort of becomes, the more the word becomes pedantic and less taboo, and we have that sort of, that assumed existence of feminism in our everyday environment. I'm hoping it'll diversify, and you don't need, freaks with big mouths like me to postulate on what feminism is, because everybody will have their own idea of it, and that will become a much more common exchange.
So feminism is a state of mind as opposed to, a matter of gender.
Oh yeah.
How did you get to that state of mind? Was there something you read? Was there something you heard? Was there a movie you saw? Was it your mother? Was it a grandmother?
Well, it probably did start with my mother, because she was a very strong figure, and very independent, and she was always working from day one, and then when I was about 12 or something, she decided she'd had enough of my father and, the whole, ridiculous, chaotic family, and she just shipped out, and she was always very independent, and she always, from very early on in my life, sort of treated me, as though I was a free agent. I was responsible for myself, and so I was, and I think that was very empowering to me, that she empowered me, and then beyond that, I think it was, when I got to college, eventually, like when I was 19 or something, I think I read, I took Feminism 101, but at that point, I was there in that room because I had already started to become politicized, mainly by my relationships, and, finding my integrity in jeopardy and, various relationships and, all that kind of like interpersonal gender dynamics that start, from, pubescence with women. And I found myself become, sort of recognizing some of my anger in certain situations and trying to examine that and figure out, more concisely, what my view was on the whole sort of gender dynamic in my little society and time and place. So I think, just, personal experience really brought me to feminism.
So Ani, one of the interesting things about you is that you started your own record company and you're somewhat involved in your own distribution. How did you go about doing that?
Wow. Well, it was a long road. We just sort of, it was kind of a taking it a day at a time kind of thing. I never really had a grand plan about, being my own record company but I always sort of had the feeling that I could make albums without a big corporation, that it wasn't necessary to work for Warner Brothers in order to make and distribute art. So I started making albums when I was 18 and did it very on a very low budget, and I sold them at my shows first, just off the stage, and then started getting local distribution in independent stores in my hometown of Buffalo and Western New York, and then in New York City, and that was it was run out of my manager's house. Righteous Bay Records was originally in his dining room, and we did mail orders, and we started the sort of local regional distribution, and then people glued into what I was doing, like Lady Slipper Distribution, which is a national women's music distribution company, and other women's music. In the beginning, it was very much the women's music community that supported me and first started, distributing my album through, in the Midwest and in the Southeast. And so there was Lady Slipper and Goldenrod and various other. And then we sort of started accumulating more and more regional distribution companies, which basically just buy the records wholesale and then get them to stores. And it was somewhat haphazard and a little chaotic and not all that effective. So we sort of consolidated to one independent national distribution company, again, that buys wholesale and just distributes the album, and also retained our relationships with the women's music distributors because they had been so supportive from the beginning. So now we use a company called Koch International, and as well as the old women's music distributors. And I mean, my advice for people who want to make music independently, who have some kind of adversity to the sort of corporate music industry, I think that it's more and more possible to make sub-corporate music. Back in the day, Woody Guthrie would record for Columbia Records and get $25 at the end of the day, and that's it. It was a good day's work for him. But I think now, the technological means are much more accessible to people, in terms of recording equipment, and I'm sitting in front of a video camera and we're making a movie, and that certainly wasn't possible, for most people 20 years ago. But now people can make albums and newspapers and zines and films and independently, and And I'm hoping that that is of interest to people who, for political reasons. And so my only advice is just to get out and play. Young musicians are always coming up to me and saying, well, how do you get the national distribution and the crew and the boss and the manager and the booking agent? And, they sort of want the magic key. And I think, well, the way that I did it was by going out to every local bar and playing as many nights a week as I could for about 10 years, and you build an audience organically, word of mouth. And I've been touring steadily for as long as I can remember. And that's the way that you build a sort of an audience base without corporate marketing and publicity and demographic studies and huge advertising budgets, and which is basically the way that the music industry creates people in 6 months from out of nowhere, based upon a radio hit single. So this takes a lot more time.
What about radio play? How important is that? Have you utilized it? And
well, most of my radio play up until very recently, well, and still is, all until very recently, was college and community radio, public radio and college radio, where the playlists were not dictated by the industry or the marketplace. But, so how important is airplay? Most of my songs are not very radio friendly, so I don't get a lot of airplay. But again, I'm just traveling constantly. I'm just out, you can't really hear me on the radio very much, but I'm bound to show up in your town, a couple times a year at least. And so that's pretty much my big, marketing scheme. It's much more in the tradition of folk singers, than sort of pop commercial music. Folk singers, all my folk singer friends and me, that's what we do. We travel, we talk to people, we play for people. It's a very, we're working musicians, as Utah would say. It's a job, as opposed to, trying to create some sort of magic in a recording studio and have some kind of, hit single.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Utah Phillips, because one of the most fun albums I've listened to recently is the album that you produced and did the background music for. I was very impressed with that. How did that all come about?
Well, Utah and I share a booking agent. We have the same people that book our performances. And so they had booked us both in Philadelphia on the same night. So there we were in Philly, and in good folk singer fashion, we were billeted at the same house. Some brain surgeon or something was putting up the wayward folk singers. So we were both staying in the same house in Philly and met in the kitchen one night. This was about 5 years ago, and I just took an immediate shine to the guy. So I wrote him a letter a couple years later and asked him if he wanted to do an album, because I had always had a dream of putting out other people's music on Righteous Babe Records, which I plan to do more and more of. And Utah was just, a sort of standout idea as a first release.
Well, Ani, thank you very much. As we leave now, is there anything you'd like to...
Hi, this is Roger Leisner for Radio Free Maine. And you've been listening to singer, musician, poet, Ani DiFranco, answering that question, what is the future of feminism?